When a journalist challenges Karoline's faith, her powerful response leaves everyone stunned. Watch how it might change your own beliefs, too. Everything seemed routine in the NBC newsroom as the team prepared for a high-profile guest on James Claron's show. Known for his relentless attacks on Republicans and people of faith, Claron never held back. On his popular podcast, he passionately argued that God is nothing more than a fabricated illusion, a crutch for the weak. And tonight, he was ready to challenge yet another believer, determined to dismantle their faith piece by piece. This time, he was set to interview Karoline Leavitt, a young woman known for her unwavering faith in God. She didn't just talk about her beliefs, she embodied them. The cross necklace she wore was a quiet but powerful statement of her devotion. But this interview wasn't about debating faith or questioning God's existence. It was supposed to focus on Trump's initiatives, or at least that's what Karoline believed. As she took her seat, James Claron welcomed her with polite words, but what followed left not only Karoline but the entire audience in shock. "You wear the cross. I'm fascinated by how a young girl like you still believes that God exists," asked James. The question rippled through the audience, sparking murmurs of intrigue and tension. Karoline's expression faltered for a brief moment. She hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn so soon, but it happened. And yet she remained calm. Karoline took a slow breath, steadying herself. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. Inside, a storm brewed. She had walked into this interview prepared to discuss policy, not to defend her faith on national television. Yet, she knew this moment mattered. She glanced at the audience. Some leaned forward, eyes locked on her, waiting. Others exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and skepticism. The weight of their anticipation pressed on her, but she refused to waver. With a composed smile, she finally responded, her voice unwavering. "Well, I didn't expect something like this. But for your record, God does exist." A brief silence filled the room before whispers spread through the audience. Some nodded in approval, while others exchanged doubtful glances. A few skeptics smirked, waiting to see how James Claron would respond. The tension thickened, but Karoline remained poised, ready for whatever came next. James Claron let out a chuckle, shaking his head slightly as if amused. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and smirked. "Ah, the confidence," he said, voice laced with sarcasm. "You say that like you had coffee with him this morning. Did he share any stock tips?" A few laughs rippled through the audience. Claron basked in the reaction, tilting his head. "But really," he continued, "in an age of science and reason, how does someone like you still cling to something so outdated?" Karoline's fingers tightened slightly around the armrest, but her expression remained steady. She refused to let the smirks and scattered laughter rattle her. Instead, she took a slow breath, straightened her posture, and met Claron's gaze with quiet confidence. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence unsettled him more than any immediate retort could have. The audience, sensing the shift, leaned in. Then, with a calm, unwavering voice, she finally spoke. "Well, James, I suppose faith isn't as outdated as you think. After all, you're still so fascinated by it." James raised his eyebrows, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Fascinated? Oh, Karoline, let's not get ahead of ourselves," he quipped. "I'm fascinated by ancient myths, too, but that doesn't mean I think Zeus is out there throwing lightning bolts." The audience chuckled, emboldening him. He leaned back, arms crossed. "But hey, I'll give you this. You wear faith well. It's almost charming, like a kid still believing in Santa Claus." A tense silence followed, broken only by scattered laughter from the audience. Karoline could feel the weight of every eye on her, some amused, some curious, others waiting to see if she would crack. For a fleeting moment, the thought of leaving crossed her mind. Walking out would be easy, escaping the ridicule, the condescending smirks. But she knew that if she did, it wouldn't just be her walking away from an interview. It would be a silent admission that her faith wasn't strong enough to withstand the challenge. And that wasn't an option. So she stayed. Instead of retreating, she lifted her chin, her grip on the armrest easing. If James Claron wanted a battle of words, she wouldn't cower. She wasn't here to argue faith with someone determined to mock it. But she wasn't going to let him define it either. With a slow, deliberate breath, she steadied herself. Then she met his gaze, ready to answer. Karoline didn't fire back right away. Instead, she let the moment stretch, the tension thick in the air. The bright studio lights cast a sharp contrast between her calm expression and James's smug demeanor. The audience, once entertained by his wit, now sat in quiet anticipation. Even the cameramen, who usually focused only on their angles, seemed to be paying attention. She finally leaned forward, resting her hands lightly on the sleek, reflective table. Her cross necklace glinted under the overhead lights as she spoke. "All right, James, let's set my belief aside for a moment. Let me ask you something." James smirked, still holding on to his usual bravado. "Oh, this should be good." Karoline didn't flinch at his sarcasm. Instead, she nodded slightly, as if considering her words carefully. "You believe in science, right?" He scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "Obviously, unlike faith, it's based on evidence." "Fair enough," she said smoothly. She glanced at the audience, whose expressions ranged from skepticism to curiosity, before turning back to him. "So, tell me, where did the universe come from?" James blinked, as if he hadn't expected something so fundamental. "The Big Bang," he answered, his tone almost dismissive. "Basic astrophysics." Karoline tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "And before that?" A flicker of hesitation passed over James' face, but he masked it quickly. "Well, matter and energy existed in a singularity before expanding." She leaned in just slightly, her voice gentle yet pressing. "And where did that singularity come from?" James shifted in his seat. The confidence in his smirk dimmed just a little. A murmur rippled through the audience, a low hum of interest. "That's still being studied," he admitted, adjusting his tie as if it had suddenly grown too tight. Karoline caught the subtle discomfort in his posture, the slight twitch of his fingers, the way he pressed his lips together before responding. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Instead, they were transfixed. Some nodded in agreement with Karoline, while others leaned forward, waiting to see if James would regain control of the conversation. She let the pause breathe before speaking again, her voice steady and unwavering. "So, we don't really know." James exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping against the table. "Science doesn't claim to have all the answers, Karoline," he said, forcing a chuckle. "Unlike religion, it doesn't rely on made-up stories to explain the unknown." Karoline smiled, unfazed. "I see. So, you're willing to believe in something you can't fully explain yet?" James opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated. His jaw tightened, his usual quick wit suddenly betraying him. A few gasps and whispers flickered through the crowd, the shift in energy palpable. Karoline leaned in just enough to keep the pressure on, but her tone remained calm. "You trust science because it gives you theories based on observation, right? But even science admits there are limits to what we understand. So tell me, James, if you can accept an origin of the universe that no one can fully explain, why is the idea of a creator so ridiculous?" The room fell into complete silence. Even the sound crew, who typically remained indifferent, had paused their work. The audience's eyes darted between Karoline and James, some stunned, others nodding thoughtfully. A few exchanged glances, as if realizing, perhaps for the first time, the weight of the question she had just posed. James clenched his jaw slightly, his fingers drumming against the table with forced casualness. His smirk had all but vanished. For the first time that night, he looked like a man caught off guard. Karoline didn't need to press further. She simply leaned back, her expression calm and composed, letting the gravity of her words settle between them. Maybe faith and science aren't as different as you think. The studio remained silent for a beat longer, then a few quiet murmurs spread, followed by hesitant applause. James, for once, had no quick comeback. James sat in silence, his smirk now completely gone. The weight of Karoline's words had settled over the room like a thick fog. But though he had no immediate comeback, he wasn't about to concede. Losing a debate wasn't something he was used to, especially not to someone he had dismissed at the beginning. His fingers tapped rhythmically against the glossy table, his mind racing. The silence stretched, the audience hanging on the moment. Then, with a deep breath, he forced a chuckle, one that lacked its usual sharpness. "Well," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "That's a nice little argument you've built there, Karoline. Very well rehearsed." Karoline didn't flinch, her steady gaze locked onto his. "But let's step away from your philosophical gymnastics," James continued, leaning back in his chair as he folded his arms. "You talk about God like he's this ultimate force of good, like faith is something pure." His jaw tightened. "Tell me, where was your God during the Crusades, during the Inquisition, during every religious war that's left thousands, millions dead?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Some nodded in agreement, others bristled. The temperature in the room seemed to shift. James leaned forward now, emboldened by the reaction. "Let's not forget the extremists who kill in his name, the churches that silence victims, the wars fought over doctrine." He gestured widely, his voice rising. "Tell me, Karoline, where is the goodness of faith when people use it as a weapon, when it's been responsible for some of the greatest atrocities in history?" A few scattered claps erupted from the audience, likely from those who had shared James's skepticism from the beginning. He exhaled sharply, his smirk returning. "You want me to believe in something that has caused more division, more death, more suffering than anything else?" The weight of his words hung in the air, thick with tension. Karoline could feel the eyes on her, waiting for her response. But she wasn't shaken. If anything, she seemed more composed than ever. She took a slow breath, then leaned forward, her hands resting on the table with quiet confidence. "James," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "You blame faith for the actions of men. But let me ask you something. Has science never been used for destruction?" James blinked. The question had caught him off guard. "Atomic bombs," Karoline continued, her tone measured. "Chemical warfare, eugenics, manipulated medicine. Science has been twisted for power, for death, for suffering. Should we dismiss science because some have used it for harm?" The room was silent. The audience, once murmuring, was now still. James's smirk faltered. "The problem," Karoline said. Karoline's voice remained steady, her gaze unwavering. Faith itself wasn't the enemy. It was how people twisted it to serve their own desires. Just as science had been a tool for both healing and destruction, so had religion. James spoke of the Crusades, of violence, but he ignored the hospitals founded by believers, the lives saved, the quiet acts of kindness carried out in God's name. He overlooked the movements for peace, led by those whose faith called them to love, not hate. Faith wasn't the corruption. Human hands were. She let her words breathe before continuing. If you blame God for man's evil, you must credit him for their good. Faith isn't the problem. Human nature is. James's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the audience, as if searching for support, but found many of them staring at him with new consideration. Some looked at Karoline with quiet admiration. Even those who weren't convinced couldn't deny that she had stood her ground. She leaned back, folding her hands in her lap. "So tell me, James," she said, mirroring his earlier challenge, "is it really faith you have a problem with, or is it just the way people choose to use it?" The room fell silent once again. The audience didn't know whether to clap or hold their breath. James looked down for a moment, his fingers drumming against the table. He had thrown every argument he had at her, and yet she hadn't stumbled. She hadn't just defended her faith. She had exposed the flaw in his own logic. And for the first time in his career, James Claron had nothing left to say. James sat still, his fingers interlocked, his jaw tight. The sharp wit, the smug confidence, gone. The weight of Karoline's words pressed down on him like an undeniable truth he couldn't twist or mock. He had thrown everything at her, every insult, every argument, every attempt to corner her, and yet she sat there, unshaken. The audience, once divided, now watched him in silence. Even those who had sided with him earlier seemed to realize what had just happened. James Claron, the journalist known for dismantling believers with cold logic and cutting sarcasm, had met his match. A tense moment passed. He exhaled slowly, forcing a half smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, Karoline," he finally said, his voice lacking its usual edge, "I guess you have a way with words." Karoline gave him a small, polite smile. She wasn't here to gloat. She straightened in her seat, glancing briefly at the audience before turning back to James. "Now," she said, her voice light but firm, "let's talk about what I actually came here for." The tension in the room shifted instantly. The audience, still processing what had just happened, stirred as the conversation moved forward. James nodded, defeated but holding on to what little dignity he had left. And, just like that, Karoline had not only won the debate, she had taken control of the entire interview. If this story struck a chord, the next one will linger in your mind long after the screen fades. Click the video on your screen to step into another powerful tale, one that will challenge, inspire, or even change the way you see the world. Don't miss it. Your next journey is just a click away.